Welcome to tonight's Braver Angels debate. I imagine many of you have been to Braver Angels events before, but for any newcomers, first of all, a hearty welcome to you. And second, Braver Angels, as you will shortly learn, is a national nonprofit devoted to bringing the country together across the partisan divide. Tonight, you are in for one of our most special experiences, which is a Braver Angels debate. Now, Braver Angels debate is a little bit different from what a lot of people think of when they think of the word debate, first and foremost in its spirit. When a lot of people think of debate, they think of maybe presidential debates or the kind of competitive debate where you like try to one up the other side and get the most points. But what we consider to be our pursuit here is a collective search for truth. And so the number one rule, which all of our panelists have very kindly agreed to follow tonight, is that you will say only what you believe on our floor, and that we invite you to say sort of all of what you believe. So the doubts, the nuances, the complexities, all of that, because we're really here to try to have a good conversation. There are a couple little details that I'll share that may be relevant to you tonight. The first is if you need any help with technology, we aren't able to allow folks to chat, and so you should email eventhelp@braverangels.org. Additionally, pardon me, sorry about that. Yep. So we have closed captions available, and the instructions to that are also in the chat. The resolution for tonight is resolved pass HR 1, which, as most of you know, is the large piece of legislation going through Congress right now that has to do with voting laws. And I will let our various panelists speak to different sides of it. But the final two things you need to know before I pass this over to Silas Kulkarni to introduce our panelists are, first of all, we invite you to ask questions. And the way that you can do that is you can submit them through a form that staff team, if you would stick that in the chat, that would be great. And we will be filtering through the questions as we go, and we'll hopefully be able to ask yours. The form, if you do get called on, in which we ask those questions is as follows. Madam Chair, the prior speaker said, whatever they said, I'd like to ask him or her, and then whatever your question is. And so you'll notice there that you put it in the third person. And that's because it takes a question that's sort of like, you know, Dell, how could you think this? And makes it into, Madam Chair, Dell said this. I'd like to know this, that, or the other. So that's our method for asking questions. And then the other thing to know is we have a tradition called jazz hands. So these are jazz hands. We have the choreographer Fosse to thank for them. And I also learned recently that it's the sign language for applause, which is extra cool. And what they are is they're a way for us to show approval. And so I will be inviting panelists especially, but also anybody at home. Anytime you hear something you like, just give it some jazz hands. I have taken to doing this even like at the dinner table with my fiance. He thinks I'm weird, but I think that it's a way for us to express that like we're in this together. This is an experience for all of us. And so panelists, I know that most of you are new to this, but if you would show me your jazz hands, I would be grateful. Yes, excellent. Okay, beautiful. Silas Kulkarni, who's the chief of staff of the debate team here at Braver Angels, has done just enormous amount of work putting together tonight's debate. And so Silas, I'd like you to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Who do we have with us tonight?
Great. I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order they're going to be speaking tonight. So first up on our roster is Zach Beechen. Zach Beechen is a staff writer and senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers the future of democracy, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas. He is also the host of Worldly, Vox's weekly podcast on foreign policy and international affairs. And in his spare time, he enjoys reading fantasy novels and tinkering with his peanut tofu recipe. We're going to chat right now his bio and a link to some of his writing on this topic into the chat box. And Zoom Whips, if you have trouble finding that, just let me know and I can chat that in. Next up in our lineup is Craig Engel. Craig, if you could wave hi. Craig is a partner at Arendt Fox LLP and has over 35 years experience advising political committees, nonprofits, candidates and office holders, and others on all aspects of election, tax, and ethics law. Craig joined the firm in 2001 after a career on Capitol Hill. He has served as general counsel to 2 presidential campaigns and co-authored 3 amicus briefs to the United States Supreme Court, including related to Citizens United. You'll find his bio and links to his organization in the chat box as well. Next after Craig is Osita Nwanevu, Osita Nwanevu. Osita, if you could wave to the audience. Osita is a staff writer at the New Republic. He's a former staff writer at the New Yorker and Slate, and his work has also appeared in Harper's Magazine, In These Times, and in the Chicago Reader. Nwanevu is the former editor-in-chief of the Southside Weekly, a Chicago alternative newspaper, and a graduate of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Next up on our agenda after Osita will be Kaylee McGee-White. Kaylee McGee-White is a commentary writer for the Washington Examiner, focusing on religion, politics, and culture. Kayla, if you can wave to the audience as I'm speaking. She regularly appears on Fox News, and her work has been featured in Real Clear Politics, The Weekly Standard, The Detroit News, the Orange County Register, and more. She graduated from Hillsdale College with a degree in politics and journalism. After Kaylee, we're going to Sheba Williams. Sheba Williams, could you wave for the audience? Sheba Williams is the founder and executive director of the nonprofit No Left Turns. Through her work as a mobile barber stylist and her involvement in community service projects, Sheba found that more people than she realized had at least one thing in common with her: a felony conviction. No Left Turns was born to be a support system for those with justice and court involvement, but quickly evolved into a day-to-day fight for removing the policies and stigmas around a past conviction. Sheba has a BS in business management from Norfolk State University and has professional licenses in cosmetology and barbering. Next up on the negative would be Sarah Longwell. Sarah, if you could wave to the camera. Sarah Longwell is the president and CEO of Longwell Partners, a full-service communications firm. Sarah is a co-founder of the organization Defending Democracy Together and spokeswoman for its project Republicans for the Rule of Law. She's also the publisher of The Bulwark. A longtime Republican strategist and former national board chair of the Log Cabin Republicans, Sarah launched Longwell Partners to engage in issues beyond partisan politics and focus on solving some of the country's most intractable problems through cross-partisan coalitions. Our last two speakers are both members or former members of the House of Representatives. Representative Dean Phillips, could you wave to the audience, please? Representative Dean Phillips is a Democratic member of the U.S. Congress representing Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District. Prior to working as an elected official, he worked for his family's distilling and gelato businesses. During his time in Congress, he continues to serve as co-owner of 3 coffee shops in the Twin Cities and is active in their philanthropic community in Minnesota. In Congress, Dean is focused on restoring America's faith in government. He's on a mission to inspire a new era of collaboration in Washington and end the corrupting influence of special interest money in our politics. Last but certainly not least is Representative Dennis Ross. If you could wave for us, Dennis Ross. Representative Ross was also a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, a Republican member serving from Florida for 8 years, following his 8 years as a member of the Florida House of Representatives. Prior to his experience in office, he practiced law, ultimately starting his own firm. Representative Ross currently serves as the director of the American Center for Political Leadership at Southeastern University. The ACPL is dedicated to the mission of advocating for increased civic engagement through the development of research-based curriculum which teaches civil discourse and promotes citizen participation. If I could have a warm round of jazz hands for all of our panelists who are extremely excited to welcome today. We thank you so much for being with us and for participating in this very important conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, and thank you, Silas, for introducing everyone. And without further ado, I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. But I did want to give any new folks just a preview. So the way that this will go is there will be an affirmative speech, which means you're in favor of passing HR 1, and then questions, and then a negative speech, and then questions. We'll go on like that for a while. And then eventually there will be response speeches, which will be a little bit shorter, and there will not be questions between those. So if you have a question, go ahead and stick it into our form. And like I said, hopefully we'll get to as many people as we can. And panelists, you will all be invited to ask the first question after each speaker as we move other folks into the room. So without further ado, I would like to call this debate to order. Unresolved pass HR 1. I'm looking for a first speech in the affirmative. And for that, we will go to Mr. Beechen. Go ahead and unmute yourself. You have 4 minutes.
Hey, April, thanks for having me in this event, and thanks to all these panelists for participating. I'm going to start with a really big claim that I hope to explain in 4 minutes by going through 200 years of political history, which is that American democracy is at moral peril. This may seem alarmist, it may seem extreme, it may seem totally overblown, but I hope to, in the next 3 or so minutes, persuade you that it's a threat to be taken seriously. We're experiencing a kind of democratic decline that I've seen in other countries. I've seen in firsthand in places like Hungary and in places like Israel. Serious, serious threats to a democratic system emerging from one party's misbehavior on the inside of it that's corrupting democracy from the inside. Now, let's start with this 200 years of political history thing. There's some debate over, at least some misunderstanding, I might say, over what the American system was supposed to do. This quote from James Madison, I think, clears it up fairly well. In a Republican system, the characteristic rule of which is the major will of the prevailing ruling will. That is to say, the majority. Madison is very clear on this point. The founding documents are extremely clear on this point. Majorities should rule. There should be checks on majority rule, and they designed things like the Senate and the Electoral College to do that in a way. But these checks are being abused right now. They're being abused because of the particular demographics of the American electorate, such that rural voters are given significant amounts of overweighting inside the Electoral College and inside the Senate. As a result, the party that is disproportionately white and rural, the Republican Party, has a leg up, a significant leg up. Now, this in and of itself would not be an existential threat to democracy, but the Republican strategy for the past about 12 years has been to take these rules and exacerbate them, to make the system so unfair and so tilted in their direction that it's very, very hard and increasingly difficult for them to lose. So in 2010, there were a series of nationally funded campaigns for extreme gerrymanders and voter ID bills. The gerrymanders are very difficult to overstate how much they've rigged the House of Representatives, which is supposed to be a fully majoritarian body, in the Republican direction. I will read a quote from Representative David Lewis of North Carolina, who wrote one of these gerrymanders to make the intent clear. I think electing Republicans is better than electing Democrats. So I drew this map in a way to help foster what I think is better for the country. Nonpartisan analyses and academic analyses have found no comparison between Democratic gerrymandering and Republican gerrymandering. The House is systematically rigged in one party's favor. And that's in 2010. Of course, we all know what happened in the 2020 election with one president, the Republican incumbent president, denying the legitimacy of an election that by all counts was in fact a legitimate election. We saw that there was systematic backing from the party. We saw dissenters being pushed out of the party, and we saw an attack on the Capitol itself. Then after that, we've seen 361 suppressive voting bills in state houses. Two pretty significant ones, SB 202 in Georgia and SB 7 in Texas. The Georgia bill strips Brad Raffensperger, who was one of the few secretaries of state to really vocally stand up to Trump's electoral interference in a public big way, of his authorities, of many of them, in supervising voting in the state, and gives it to themselves, that is to say, the Republican-controlled legislature. In Texas, SB 7 cuts the number of polling places available in basically urban Democratic counties to make it harder for, and we shouldn't put too fine a point on this, minorities who are Democratic leaning to vote. You've seen Aaron Van Langefeld, the local board of canvassers lead in the state, who stood up to Trump's electoral interference efforts again by voting to confirm the election results, pushed out by the state Republican Party. Now in 21 to 22, in this current round of redistricting, Republicans are making it harder and harder for Democrats to win in the House. H.R. 1 can address that through its ban on partisan voting gerrymandering. And it has another series of other important provisions like felon reenfranchisement and automatic voter registration that could more broadly help with the crisis of democracy and addressing it. So in 4 minutes, I hope to have shown you that there is one party that rejects the principle of majority rule. It's not the Democratic Party, it's the Republican Party. And without legislation like H.R. 1 passed swiftly and quickly, there's a very good chance that the results of the next few elections won't be the results of free and fair elections, but rigged ones.
All right. And so first of all, a round of jazz hands for our first brave speaker. Thank you very much. Yes, very good. And we will take our first question from a panelist. Panelists, you can raise your physical hands as though we're, actual embodied people here. So if anyone has a question, you may raise your hand. Otherwise, we can go to attendee questions. Mr. Farron, the question you had submitted that we think is great is, and this is for you, Zach, Mr. Beechen, how will the integrity of mail-in ballots be protected in H.R. 1?
I think the question is not well placed. There are a lot and very effective state-based protections for mail-in ballots that safeguarded mail-in ballots really effectively in the last election. Despite an exhaustive search by the president and his team, there was virtually no evidence of systematic mail-in fraud. There are multiple different checks in the counting process that prevent it from happening right now. So federal overhauls of legislation regarding elections doesn't cover every aspect of it. So I don't think it's important to focus on something that states do well already in HR 1. The important questions are what it can repair in terms of the defects in oversight of state law.
All right, very good. And then I think I saw you raise a question, Ms. Longwell, was that right? All right, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, I'm wondering if Mr. Beechen thinks that there's anything about HR 1 that sort of puts its thumb on the scale for Democrats, or is it purely about protecting access to voting rights, or is it more partisan than that? Or I would be interested in his thoughts about the partisan nature of it.
So I think, can I start talking?
Yes, please. Yes, go right ahead.
So I think it's a very interesting question and a difficult one in a lot of ways. HR 1 could be considerably more loaded in the Democratic direction than it is if it changed the redistricting standards in particular to focus on, for example, proportionality, in which the proportion of a state's vote, that is, if it goes 60% Democratic, then there should be 60% roughly of House members who would be Democratic from that state. HR 1 doesn't do that right now. Its standards for redistricting reform, for example, are pretty vague. So I actually think it would be a better piece of legislation if it were more loaded in the partisan direction, not because Democrats should be advantaging themselves, but because right now the Democratic deficit in the United States is loaded on one side, right? There is an effort by one party to undermine and suborn the fairness of elections. And the other party is not doing enough to prevent the leg up that the party that's victimizing them has given itself. It's a very odd state of affairs where Democrats are unwilling to go far enough in protecting electoral fairness in the country to preventing majority rule because they're afraid of seeming partisan. And fair enough, you shouldn't load the deck in your favor. But if what you're trying to do is to make it so the majority's will can be heard, you're on very solid, principled Democratic grounds, right? You're not doing it for partisan reasons.
Wonderful. We'll take one more question. And just before I take this question, this is not your fault, Mr. Beechen, because I didn't tell you, but questioners have 30 seconds to ask your questions, and then the answer can be up to 1 minute. And so we will try for David Kaufman. So another attendee question. David, if you're able, unmute yourself and ask your question to me.
Okay, my question is, why should the federal government try to insert itself into the state's electoral systems? It's a distinct impression that Big Brother is going to tell the states how to do business, and you could expect some significant pushback.
All right, very good, thank you.
So there are already fairly significant voting rights legislation at the federal level. And the federal government also intervenes when situations get really dire or when things are really unfair. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the most famous example. And that recently was invalidated in large part or in significant part by the Supreme Court, eliminating the pre-clearance requirement, which gave the federal government the ability to screen state laws in states with a long history of racism. So the Supreme Court knocked that down, saying that racism was gone functionally, which is a sort of dubious constitutional argument. Setting that aside, Democrats need to think more along the lines of the pre-clearance requirements. And they need to take more seriously the fact that there is a bottom-up anti-democratic sentiment in the Republican Party and treat it like it's like an existential threat to the democratic system in the way that it is. And so, yeah, I think that justifies federal legislation that may seem overbroad, may seem overbearing, may seem like an involvement in state election procedures in a way that might not be justified. I'd argue that it was justified in '65 and it's justified now.
All righty, excellent. And with that, our brave first speaker is saying. One more round of jazz hands for Mr. Beechen. Hooray. Okay, we will now move on to our first speech in the negative. Mr. Engel, go ahead. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. My part of tonight's debate is to look at H.R. 1 from a constitutional or American history perspective and see if the legislation is compatible with our country's constitutional theory. And in my opinion, I think it is not. Probably, the greatest contribution I think the framers made to the field of political science was dual sovereignty. It had never really been tried before. And the framers believed that people would be more secure in their liberty with not one, but 2 layers of government. Now that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but when those governments are dual sovereigns and they have to compete with each other, the people may have more freedoms. And I think that is shown itself to be true. And there are examples of this theory of dual sovereignty spread out throughout the Constitution. Most relevant for today is Article 1, Section 4, the Elections Clause, and Article 2, Section 1, the Electors Clause. And those 2 clauses give the primary responsibility for the conducting of elections to the states. And one of the things that the framers wanted to protect against was a self-perpetuating federal government, a government that was able to re-elect itself. So the rights and responsibilities for elections were spread out amongst the states. And that's why you often hear the phrase, there are no federal elections, there are state elections for federal offices. And it also makes kind of perfect sense to think about the states having a primary role when you look at the ballots. In the last election, there were 470 federal offices on the ballot and 10,000 state offices. So the states are doing the heavy lifting because they've got the heaviest part of the ballot. And this is also why I think all the state governments that I have seen have come out against H.R. 1. So I know that this is sometimes referred to as a Republican versus Democratic bill. I don't look at it that way. I look at this as a Washington, D.C. bill. Now, if you're a fan of the federal government, or that's all you know, well, then this bill is for you. But if you've spent time in state capitals or studied constitutional history, or even just talked to election administrators, you'll see that this bill's provisions for election administration will get you to oppose it because it's not compatible with practicalities and constitutional theory. Part of the flaw in the legislation structurally comes from, in my opinion, the lack of a federal interest being expressed in support of any or many of the provisions. There's one provision that says Congress is going to require voting equipment to be compatible with ranked choice voting. Now, what possible US government interest is there in that? Especially when I believe 78 or 48 states don't have it.
Ask you to wrap up.
Reveal about the Washington-centered version of this bill is the section on judicial review. H.R. 1 says that if you want to bring a legal challenge to any of its provisions, there is only one court in America where you can file your lawsuit. And you guessed it, it's the district court in the District of Columbia.
All right. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. You can finish your sentence if you want to.
Okay. This cancels a 50-year-old statute about where plaintiffs may bring their lawsuits. So I would close by saying, for this and several other reasons that I'd like to say some later, if I were a member of Congress, I would vote against this bill.
All right, very good. So round of jazz hands for Mr. Engel. Thank you so much for leading off
Thank you.
our negative perspective. And so we'll start with a panelist question if y'all have one. And you can raise your physical hand or your Zoom hand, either way. And all right, we will move on to a question from Steve. I'm just going to read your question, and sorry, the interwebs are making this challenging. So Steve, my impression is that your question was, why should each state have different rules on voting? Would elections be fairer if the rules and laws were consistent? Seems like a great question for you, Mr. Engel. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think each states have different provisions on voting because each state is different. Western states are different from urban states. States that have, county commissions, some states, don't. Some states have their gubernatorial elections in off years. And if there was ever a successful hack into our election system, it wouldn't be very consequential because it's so diversified. One hack couldn't hurt more than one state. If everybody had the same election system, one hack could be fatal.
Interesting. Great. Okay, so Joe, Mr. Healy. Oh, I see. We have a panel question. Mr. Beechen, go ahead and unmute yourself. Ask your question to me.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker about the balance of power between the federal government and the states in the context where the states are engaging in undemocratic practices. If it's the case, as I think it is, that a series of states are engaging in some pretty egregious anti-democratic behaviors, and there's no one to stop them given that they've entrenched themselves with state-level gerrymandering, who else but the federal government could be looked to for remedy?
All right.
What is the anti-democratic practice the questioner is referring to?
So unfortunately, we can't do dialogue very easily here. Well, just this once, Zach, excuse me, Mr. Beechen, I'll let you answer, but just know for future that got to say it all in the question.
Sure. We can start with two examples. Extreme gerrymanders in North Carolina and Wisconsin, and felon disenfranchisement in a series of states, but we can talk about Florida as a particularly interesting example because they overrode a referendum trying to enfranchise felons by imposing penalties that made it difficult for felons to register.
Okay.
Well, I think the Supreme Court has already taken care of North Carolina. North Carolina has tried to redistrict itself in several ways that you would probably disagree with, and the Supreme Court did as well. So under existing jurisprudence, under redistricting, North Carolina got smacked in probably the way that you would like. As far as felon voting is concerned, I think that the referendum that passed initially was very well intended, but wasn't complete or necessarily thought through as to what the consequences of the referenda was. And it's going to take another referenda or some time, I think, to work out the details of that. But I think it's pretty clear the direction that Florida is headed on that, and that's for the enfranchisement of former incarcerated.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. One more round of jazz hands for our first neg. Thank you. See, this is the thing. It always makes people smile. I love it.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Mr. Engel. So we will now go to our second speech in the affirmative. And for that, Mr. Wanevu, go ahead and unmute. You have 4 minutes.
So I've been placed by organizers on the affirmative side tonight. And while I think that's fair, as I do strongly support the For the People Act, I don't think I can explain why I support it without also explaining a problem I have with the common argument advocates have been making for it. It's become commonplace to say that a democracy is under attack, that efforts by Republicans to restrict voting rights, and the spurious claims Republicans have made about the 2020 election represent existential threats to our democratic system of government. And for its advocates, the provisions of the For the People Act have been understood as a critical line of defense against them. And we often hear Democrats and pundits say that the passage of the For the People Act will save American democracy. The problem I have with this argument is the United States is not really a democracy, not at the federal level. We have the trappings of one. People go out and vote, and there are open debates like the one we're having tonight. But when we examine the actual structure of our federal political system, it's clear that America actually fails to meet some of the basic expectations one might have of a democracy. In the first place, there isn't really a reliable relationship between the preferences of most of the American people and our political outcomes. The easiest examples to name here would be the elections of George W. Bush and Donald Trump, but this is actually a much deeper issue than the Electoral College. As political scientists, legal experts, and constitutional scholars have said with increasing volume over the last several years, the design of Congress, the Senate's adoption of certain rules for itself, and the institution that the Supreme Court has become are all factors that make it incredibly difficult for policies that the American majority or even an American plurality might desire to pass. And that's because we have a federal political system that was designed to give some Americans, mathematically, more of a say in our government than others. Every state gets 2 senators and at least 3 electoral votes, no matter how small they happen to be. And as a consequence, an individual voter for a Senate race in Wyoming, for instance, has 70 times the amount of influence a voter in California does in that chamber, as a matter of simple arithmetic, given the size of each state's population. And this, to me, is one of the many ironies of the Republican push against voter fraud, an effort the Republicans will tell you is an effort to prevent one voter from counting more times in an election than another. We don't actually have a voter fraud crisis in this country. We don't have, contrary to the claims of Republicans still inspecting ballots for bamboo fibers from China, a major problem with our voting machines. But we do have a federal political system that, by design, confers more political power upon some Americans than others on the basis of where they happen to live. And Republicans often defend that design by arguing that the United States is a republic and not a democracy. Now, liberals tend to raise objections to this and get into the semantics of what Republican government really means. From my perspective, conservatives are more right than wrong. The framers didn't all agree that the present design of our political system made sense, and they fought bitterly about what would. But at the end of the day, when they came out of that convention in 1787, they came away with a political system that went several steps beyond protecting minority rights to confer more political standing on some Americans than others, a system that, from my perspective, cannot meaningfully be called democratic. And what does the For the People Act have to do with all this? Well, I'm a fan of democracy, personally. And I don't think the idea that America isn't a democracy is a terribly good argument as to why we shouldn't become one someday. But we will stand absolutely no chance whatsoever of achieving large-scale reforms to the American political system if we can't even protect our existing quasi-democratic system from efforts to resegregate the right to vote and disenfranchise the segments of the American public that conservatives are threatened by. The For the People Act is not a perfect bill. Provisions of it have rightfully been criticized, even by some Democrats, as vague and sloppy. But my hope is that if a final bill does come to a vote, and it's not obvious that one will, given the structural obstacles I've been speaking about, the Congress will have before it a piece of legislation strong enough to protect the American voter. And I'm grateful that the bill that we have now, as imperfect as it is, has inspired clarifying conversations about where the project, not the reality, but the project of the American democracy ought to go from here.
Wonderful. All right. First of all, customary round of jazz hands for Mr. Wanevu. Very good. Yes. A little bit spicy. I like it. Okay. Are there any questions from panelists that have occurred to you thus far? If so, feel free to raise your hand. And if not, we will go to questions from attendees. And just a quick note, because I know that the technology has been a little tricky tonight. So the raising your hand via Zoom, the electronic hand, isn't the way that we're doing this. What we're doing is folks are submitting questions via that link that keeps getting posted. And then we will move you into the room to ask your question. You won't see your video, but you will have the ability to mute and unmute. That button doesn't show up until we move you into the room. And sorry to take up time explaining that, but it seemed like quite a few folks were getting confused. So let's start with, so it was, what do you think, what does the speaker think? What does Mr. Wanewu think about efforts to make it easier for states to overrule a fair election? And Mr. Wanewu, you can unmute and give your answer.
So that's for me.
Yeah.
What do I think about efforts to overrule? Okay, I mean, I think that is worrisome. I think Democrats are rightfully concerned about everything that we've seen after November, the attack on the Capitol, all the things that Zach was talking about. All of that is troublesome for sure. But ultimately, I think that the real problem we have in this country, as I said in my opening remarks, is the fact that from the outset, we had a system that was pretty structurally flawed. And I think we can actually blame some of those structural flaws for the rise of Donald Trump to begin with, the election of Donald Trump to begin with, and the power Republicans have to pursue extreme policies and pursue attacks on voting rights without the fear that the public is going to create a real electoral backlash to them. They're insulated from a lot of the criticism they might face for what they're doing in the South by the fact that the federal political system is designed in such a way that advantages conservatives. If that weren't the case, Republicans, I think, would be a lot more reluctant to start, throwing people off the voting rolls, to gerrymander as aggressively as they have been. And obviously, the structure of the system is the thing that's preventing the For the People Act from having a real chance of passage unless Democrats, get serious in the Senate. So, I think that the actions that we're seeing from the Republican Party are obviously troublesome, at least obviously to anybody who is a Democrat or sort of believes broadly in small d democracy. But they don't. That's not the fundamental problem that we're facing. I think that we have deeper structural issues with American democracy that I hope the For the People Act puts us in the right direction towards addressing.
All right, very good. And next question we'll take from Harry Boyd. Mr. Boyd, I see that you're already unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question to me.
Madam Chairman, or Chairwoman, thank you. So I'm thinking about the kind of the democratic civic dimensions of the American founding moment. And one of the most dramatic was the 10th Amendment, which read, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this is a much broader point than simply voting. It really is about civic empowerment. So my question to the speaker is, how does your support for his how does his support support or erode the 10th Amendment?
All right.
Well, my argument isn't really based on a consonance with the American Constitution. My argument is based on what I think makes sense for a democratic system in 2020, and not what would have made sense a couple of centuries ago or 100 years ago. I think that we face a set of challenges as a modern democracy that the founders could not have anticipated, and that the people who authored all the amendments to the Constitution up till the early 90s and the last one could not have anticipated. And we should be making our judgments about the design of a political system on the basis of the problems that we're now facing. I think that one thing you can take from the founders, though, is a sense that that is legitimate. I mean, the founders ripped up the first constitution that they drew up, the Articles of Confederation, without going through the process that the Articles of Confederation laid out for amendment. They thought that the system no longer made sense, that it was unworkable, and that it took a set of people coming together in secret in Philadelphia to come up with a new document that we now revere. But the attitude of the founders is that they had to do what it took to create a system that met the needs of the country as they saw it in that moment. And I think that we have the right to do the same thing. You can find that right in our founding document. Whenever a form of government becomes hostile to the concept of consent of the government, it says in the Declaration of Independence, the people have the right, if not a revolution, certainly of dramatic reform, to change the system and make it meet the needs and desires of the American majority. I think we're at a point where we should actively start considering not, whether this or that reform is what the founders would have wanted or what the framers would have wanted, but what actually makes sense for the problems that we're facing as a country with 330 million people, a modern economy. This is a different world than the founders envisioned from A to Z. And I don't know that we should be tethered to what they thought when we design the way we should move forward as a country.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. One more round of jazz hands for Mr. Wandevu. Very good. Yep. And so we will now move on to our second speech in the negative. And for that, I'd like to call in Ms. Kaylee McGee-White. Ms. White, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you have 4 minutes.
So proponents of HR 1 will say, as we've already heard tonight, that it's a vital piece of legislation that aims to preserve and even expand democracy in some places. But it's not. It's an overreaching bill that is full of partisan talking points that are almost certainly unconstitutional. And its goal is simple. It's an attempted power grab by Democrats who believe that they're being disenfranchised when that is not the case at all. So some of the more ridiculous parts of the bill that I think some of its proponents tend to neglect. Number one, it would abolish most voter ID laws passed by the states with no assurance whatsoever that there are still going to be protections in place to verify the eligibility of a voter. So as one of the former speakers mentioned earlier, when he said, well, there are still state laws in place to make sure that certain absentee mail-in ballots are verified. That's not necessarily the case if this bill passes, and that's the entire point of it. It would also place restrictions on states when they move to clean their voter rolls and get rid of ineligible voters, including deceased residents or residents who moved away, which makes it a lot harder to check for fraud or prevent fraud in general. And quite frankly, the federal government does not have the power to do any of this. The Constitution is clear that states have the discretion when it comes to the election process. Now, Congress does have the power to make or alter such regulations, but this power is necessarily limited. The Electors Clause in Article 2, Section 1 says Congress only has the final say over the timing of federal elections. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say Congress can mandate an entire federal elections code for the states, not even in the 15th Amendment, which bars racial discrimination in voting. And that's just the start of the problems with this bill. Essentially, you have a bill that would nationalize the elections process, take away the states' rights to govern their own elections, but it gives no guidance or support to the states that would then have to implement Congress's plan. Just as one example, one of the demands HR 1 includes says states must purchase paper-backed voting machines that comply with new standards passed by the Elections Assistant Commission earlier this year. The problem is those machines don't even exist yet. How are the states going to get those machines? Is the federal government going to reimburse them for those machines when they become available? We don't know because the bill doesn't say, and it doesn't include any provisions or make any plans for that to happen. So that's just one example that goes to show that whatever your thoughts on the 2020 election, I think most of us could probably agree that it was a disorganized disaster. We didn't have results for days. Election officials were scrambling to get all the absentee ballots in time. It was chaos. And like it or not, that chaos did contribute to the undermining faith in the election process overall. And essentially, if you're trying to nationalize an election process and force states to agree to this codified election process, you're asking for a 2020 election, minus Trump and all of the idiocy that happened with that. You're asking for disorganized chaos every single time that you have an election, unless the federal government suddenly decides to be an organized bureaucracy, which it is not. And there's also a free speech element to this bill. The bill includes campaign finance provisions. Specifically, the most problematic is personal disclosure mandates that would be required of every TV, radio, or online ad talking about principles, policies, politics, etc. That means that each of those organizations would be forced to list the names of the individuals who support those organizations and who donated to them. And it would require those individuals' private information to be uploaded in a searchable government database. So you can see how easily that could lead to harassment. It could lead to privacy violations. And that's a huge free speech concern, which even several liberal or left-leaning legal organizations have brought up to congressional Democrats. So as you can see, the problems with this bill are many. And to be honest, it's difficult to understand what it's trying to fix. We just came out of an election during which voting was easier than it's ever been before, thanks to mail-in voting. Voter registration was higher than it's ever been before as well. It broke records this year. So the idea that our voting rights are under siege is just not true. And the idea that Republicans are trying to somehow rig the game is not true, because several Democratic states have more restrictive voting access laws than Republican states. So it's not fair to make this, a party versus party issue. Now, you can obviously argue that there do need to be reasonable reforms regarding gerrymandering, which is absolutely a problem, but that is not the focus of this bill. The focus of this bill is
to wrap up
an election process and force the states to do the Democrats' bidding.
All right, thank you. So first, jazz hands for Ms. White. All right, very good. So for our first question, we're going to go to, Ms. Longwell, ask your question to me.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank the speaker. I'm interested in the point that you made about that we would all agree that, I'm sorry, that she made about the election, that we would all agree that it was a disaster. I would posit actually that considering the pandemic, it was not a disaster, and that the reason that the ballots came in late were because a number of state legislatures run by Republicans refused to allow the ballot counting to start early, which is what many of them wanted to do so that they could have results on election night. So do you accept that, or do you believe that to be true? That it could have been done much faster had the legislatures, when they were asked, agreed to start counting ballots early, as other states did, who were able to tabulate their votes the night of.
I would agree with that absolutely, and I think that Florida is actually a great example of a state that didn't get bogged down, by they did actually make sure that they started counting early ballots and mail-in ballots, absentee ballots a lot sooner than states such as my home state of Michigan, which did not change the law that required them to only start counting absentee ballots on the night of the election. So obviously you were going to have a delay because of that. My fear, though, is that if the federal government is basically assigning this codified election process to states, and they're rushing to implement it the same way that, a lot of them were rushing to implement mail-in voting, I personally don't put a lot of faith in legislatures to do what needs to be done and make this an efficient process. And I think the 2020 election was a great indication of that. We had a lot of time to prepare for what was inevitably going to be a dominantly mail-in voting based election because of the pandemic. And yet a lot of state legislatures were dragging their feet. And I don't see that changing, even if you pass a bill from Congress.
All right, and next we'll go to Steve Spar. Mr. Spar, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yeah, Ms. Chair, thank you. The speaker is very eloquent and passionate. I have a question about one aspect of HR 1, which is the requirement about nonpartisan commissions for setting districts. A lot of problems in recent elections. For example, in 2018 in Wisconsin, Democrats won 53% of the votes cast, but only got 36% of the state assembly seats. In this last election in Pennsylvania, House candidates won 54% of the votes, but only got 45% of the House seats. Is an aspect of HR 1, like the nonpartisan commissions, a good tool when one party is ignoring the will of the people by rigging the system through gerrymandering?
Certain provisions, specifically in regards to gerrymandering, I think would be beneficial, but are such a small part of the bill as a whole that it makes it really difficult to defend the bill as a whole. So gerrymandering, I think, it's absolutely a problem, and both Republicans and Democrats do it because they do want to remain in power. And it's become so ingrained in our election system that it's really hard to get rid of, because you would have to convince state legislatures to stop gerrymandering, which they're going to continue to do because they want to remain in the majority. It's the same thing with the winner takes all system, in my opinion. But so certain provisions, if Democrats or Republicans were to introduce a specific bill regarding gerrymandering, I think you'd be surprised to find how much bipartisan support it has, especially when you look at the statistics like you cited, because it is such a problem. But again, it's such a small part of HR 1 that it's really difficult to just use that to justify the bill as a whole.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. Thanks so much, and one more round of jazz hands. Excellent questions and excellent answers. Good, all right, so we will now move on to our third speech in the affirmative. And for that, I'd like to call on Ms. Sheba Williams. Sheba, go ahead, you have 4 minutes.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sheba Williams. I am the founder of No Left Turns in Richmond, Virginia. I will look to history to explain my support of HR 1. America prides itself on being a country where all men are created equal, yet they have historically been inequities in race, wealth, social equity, education, housing and food access, and most significantly, voting rights. 402 years ago, slavery began on a small colony in Virginia, now known as Jamestown. I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and a state that staunchly supported slavery, poll taxes, literacy tests, Black codes, Jim Crow laws, lynching, mass incarceration, and felony disenfranchisement. In 1902, Virginia held a convention that brought together many legislators to address voting rights. And according to Carter Glass, the most significant goal was to disenfranchise as many newly freed slaves as possible. We have essentially eliminated slavery, poll taxes, literacy tests, Black codes, and most Jim Crow laws. But tonight, On the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, we know that lynching, mass incarceration, and felony disenfranchise still exist. 6.1 million Americans have a felony conviction. Prior to 2021, Vermont, Maine, and the District of Columbia were the only states where people lost their voting rights did not lose their voting rights unless they were deemed to be morally inept to make civic decisions about their own lives. That includes school board, city council, House, Senate, and presidential candidates. The For the People Act is one of the most transformative democracy reforms in more than 4 decades that seeks to protect the rights of all people. We know that voting rights of the most vulnerable Americans have constantly been under attack since the inception of this country. Purging voter rolls has long since been a tool to disenfranchise otherwise eligible voters. Campaign finance, ethics, and accountability reform is necessary because transparency and special interest has guided many of the most well-intended bills for centuries. If we all love this country and believe that all people should be afforded the right to civic engagement, then we will vote for H.R. 1 and protect it at all costs to ensure that all people truly are able to engage in the civic process.
All right, jazz hands for Ms. Williams. Yes, very good. I will notice some panelists seem to have turned off their video. I assume that is exclusively to avoid jazz hands. When it comes to be your turn, there we go, Representative Phillips. Thank you. I was gonna say, we'll get you later. And Representative Ross, thank you so much. Jazz hands from the congressman coming in late, but not too late. All right, are there questions for Ms. Williams? Start with panelist questions if there are any. And otherwise, we will go to attendee questions. So here's one from, oops, just lost the name. Forgive me, there we go. Actually, let's go to Sarah Longwell. Yeah, panelist question. We'll take that. And ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, I'm interested if the speaker could tell us more about what are the arguments against the restorative justice that she's arguing for here. When people, obviously this is something, as you pointed out, that a lot of states don't do. So why is that?
Madam Speaker, clarification as to what a lot of states don't do.
I guess I'm asking what the argument would be for why people who've been incarcerated or convicted of crimes, what is the argument for why they shouldn't vote?
In our state, in a lot of states, they say that people who commit crimes are not morally centered to make decisions about their lives, which include things like deciding if their street should be paved or they should get a street light in their neighborhood or who should represent their children on school boards and different things like that. It's not about public safety. It is more about, and if we're going back to the history of the end of slavery, it was intentionally to disenfranchise Black people who were newly freed slaves.
Right. And then a similar question from Joe Healy from Albany, California. Why not make it as easy as possible to vote? Like, what are the reasons, some of the things that might be on the other side of that coin?
From last year's experience and years, and the only thing that I can safely say, well, I won't even say safely say, the only thing that I can justify in saying that needs to be rectified, we don't want a system where our elections are overtaken by other countries, by foreign bodies. We want the people to have the voice. What we've seen and what we've had in our past is special interests, people with money, people with authority and power, making decisions for a body of people instead of listening to the needs of the citizens of this country. There is no justification for not making it as easy as possible other than to disenfranchise people specifically because they are not the most desirable people. And that's not even talking about people who have felony convictions. We are talking about all people. We're talking about people who don't have the ability to have enough money to be in position to buy their way through different rules. So it should be made as easy as possible. It should be as comfortable as possible. We have the tools to make sure that these ballots are counted and securely assessed.
All right, very good. And we will take one more question. This is from an attendee, which says, the question is, how would the speaker feel about a compromise where federal election day was made a holiday and in-person voting was strongly encouraged? Considering that committing a crime is a choice, why should a convicted felon be allowed to vote?
Well, I am all for allowing the election day to be a federal holiday, and I think that in-person voting would be great. It is not something that is new. It is not something that has met many challenges. I am an election poll worker, and when we're talking about why people who have past convictions should be allowed to vote, I was wrongfully convicted in 2004 of a crime. There are a multitude of people who have felony convictions by means of not having access to different things like resources, food, healthcare, things that they need for their family to survive. Yes, crime is a choice, but there are some things that are crimes that we're still incarcerating people for. Namely, we're talking about marijuana convictions. While many states stand to make millions and billions of dollars off of this plant that for this failed war on drugs that we know was a problem, we still have people who are incarcerated. Slavery was a law at one time, and it was perfectly legal to hunt down and kill people who escaped from slavery just because it was documented at that time to be a correct law on our books. That does not mean that every law that you see is the moral code of our lives.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. One more round of jazz hands for Ms. Williams. Yes, very good. Thank you, Representatives Ross and Phillips. I approve. Excellent. So we are now looking for our next speech in the negative. And for that, we turn to Sarah Longwell. Sarah, go ahead and unmute. You have 4 minutes.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. So I'm about to do what people might think is an impossible task, which is that I am going to fuse the argument of Zach Beechen and as alarmed as he is about democracy, and affirm that and agree with it, while also agreeing with essentially Kayleigh's whole pitch about why HR 1 is the wrong solution to that problem. And they both made excellent arguments, so I don't need to rehash them too much, other than to say that the part that I agree with Zach about the most is that Donald Trump is told a lie to the American public. The election was stolen. And a lot of the bills moving through the states right now are an attempt to codify that lie. They are as much a PR mechanism for telling people that we need more election integrity desperately because something was horribly wrong with the 2020 election. That is false. It is not true. And it is damaging to our democracy and our faith in democracy to have a president and an entire political party feed into that lie. And if, you don't have to look any further than Liz Cheney being expelled from leadership because she continued to tell the truth about the election, because the Republicans at this point, when they say Liz Cheney's off message, what they mean is, in part, our message is that the election was stolen, and we want to be able to say that because we want to use it as part of an election strategy in 2022 and 2024. It's a grievance-based strategy. Now, so these state bills are all different on substance. Some of them are much worse than others. And if we want to get into the details of that, we can. On to Kayleigh's point, though, this bill is 800 pages long. It is only maybe a third about voting rights. It is about a third. If it's not this neat, but but I'll break it up this way. It's about a third about campaign finance and a third about ethics reform. Ethics reform should be dealt with on its own. There's a bunch of good stuff in there, tax returns, other things that deal with reining in executive power. We should do those things. We should absolutely do them separately. They do not belong in this bill about voting rights. A bunch of the campaign finance reform provisions are bad. They're just bad ideas. Many of them are unconstitutional, and Craig argued that, so I don't need to re-argue it. The matching taxpayer-funded campaign financing is a bad idea. Kayleigh made a good job of sort of explaining why so much that's in there just doesn't make a lot of sense and would be challenged. And look, a lot of the election officials don't like it. It's an unfunded mandate. It makes a bunch of, makes them do a bunch of things that they're not, prepared to do right now. It penalizes them for certain things. In any bill that is 800 pages, there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that's terrible. And the fact is, this was put together mainly by people who are left of center. And so there is very little in it. It's filled with poison pills for Republicans, things Republicans would never say yes to, which brings me to the main reason that I am against this, which is I think we have to do something to pass federal legislation around voting rights. And I think we should restore the Voting Rights Act. HR 1's not the way to do it. We should get rid of HR 1. We should put up a clean voting rights bill that includes the best provisions that exist in this bill, like nonpartisan gerrymandering reform, automatic voter registration, some of the increasing access and not some of the things that don't allow Republicans to restrict access. Pass a clean bill just on those, drop the rest. And the quicker we get over HR 1 and move past this partisan bill and put something up that some Republicans might actually be for, then we can actually have something that might potentially pass.
All right, jazz hands. Yes, very good. Interesting. So first for a panelist question, Mr. Wanevu, go ahead, ask your question to me.
My question, Madam Chair, is that given that even Liz Cheney, who had the courage, as the speaker said, to tell the truth about the November election, came out, I believe, this weekend and defended a lot of this restrictive voting laws that states are passing right now. Doesn't that raise doubts about the extent to which there is any meaningful voting reform that the Republican Party could be expected to support if even Liz Cheney isn't willing to call out what's happening?
This is a great question. I was disappointed by Liz Cheney's answer, although I think what she was doing was trying to basically make an argument for federalism and states' rights, which I think there's a different way for her to answer that question, which really was to say, actually, all of these votes are predicated on the lie that I've been out here telling you is such a problem, which is really what she should have said. Instead, she was sort of, I thought, in a mealy-mouthed way, defending the state's bills from a states' right perspective, which I can understand why she's doing, but that's not the best argument. Now, but to your specific question, which is, how would we get the 10 Republican votes we need on any voting bill when you can't even get 10 Republicans to look at the insurrection and agree to have a commission on that? That is a fair and legitimate question. Now, my answer to that is you probably can't. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't start from a place where you could get Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, because here's the thing about HR 1. Right now, you couldn't even get all the Democrats on HR 1. Manchin, Sinema, they're not even there. So you need to start from a place where you could pick up at least some Republican votes for Manchin and Sinema to get anywhere where they would even consider weakening the filibuster or making a robust pitch in favor of a voting rights bill because of, there's an existential threat to democracy. Like, it just, the strategy here to me has been very flawed.
All right, further questions. I have one actually, which I'm allowed to do because I'm the chair. I'm curious, Ms. Longwell, what strategy you think would work, not particularly with regard to the point Mr. Wanevu was making about Republicans who would support this, but more how many bills pass these days that are single issue and pure and don't have poison pills for the other party? Is there a viable strategy that you see? And I get to say you because I'm the chair and I get to do whatever I want. But is there a viable strategy that you see?
Yeah, look, I mean, here's the thing is if at some point I'm going to, in this conversation, I want to ask the Democrats this, the people I want to ask Zach this question of what's your affirmative strategy to get this passed? Because right now there isn't one to get it passed, right? Manchin has made it clear he's not going to end the filibuster over this bill. And so the question is, and I think the strategy should be, okay, what would it take? What would it take for somebody like Joe Manchin to say, this is a reasonable bill that is neutral in the way that the laws are applied, that is about increasing access to voting rights, that does not put its thumb on the scale for either party, but it makes some good neutral changes to voting laws and frankly updates. There's a bunch of things that I think could easily get more bipartisan support. Like, let's upgrade our voting apparatus to like a Windows 95 level, Like, can we even get that? Can we just get to a place where it's like a slightly higher quality? There are, and I think part of it is you have to start, and look, they're doing this on infrastructure right now. Whether it works or not, I think is yet to be seen. But you do go and you say to Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney and people who will talk to you in good faith and say, what would you go for? There's probably has to be a compromise on voter ID in some way. And like, what is a way to do that that is not restrictive or suppressive? Like those are the strategies and the conversations that have to happen. Everybody on here is going to tell you I'm a crazy optimist and that they're going to take a cynical position that this stuff can never be done, and I understand why. But I do think that is,
All right.
But otherwise this thing doesn't happen, period.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It seems fair to me. One more question for you, and this will be the final question from Chris Hoke. Also, folks, sorry to disappoint with the voicing of questions, but Zoom is just acting up too much, so I'm going to go ahead and read the questions that attendees submit for the rest of the debate. So from Chris Hoke, how do you reconcile the right to privacy in providing funds / PACs with the problem of foreign influence funding candidates? Without the reveal of who's funding the message, how do you know where the influence is coming in from, foreign or domestic, Soviet Union?
So I'm not a legal expert. Maybe Craig Engel can talk about the difference. There's a difference between foreign money in elections and domestic money in the elections. Craig, just nod if I'm right about that. I'm right about that. So that's how I'd reconcile it, is that the foreign money is different. On domestic money, the reason that we allow anonymous giving through C4s and other vehicles is because the NAACP sued way back in the day because they didn't want people who were giving them money to advance their mission to be intimidated. And I think, and so it's a constitutional free speech issue that's been ruled on and that I feel strongly about. And I think that the attempts to make people disclose their donors is about wanting to know so that people can say, I'm going to come after you for some reason or in some way because you've been giving money to this cause I don't like. And so that's why this anonymous speech is protected and that money is protected.
All right, jazz hands for Ms. Longwell. Interesting question. Yes, synthesis of several things. So we're now going to take our two representatives will be our last speakers for this initial round. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick poll break. And so we work to incorporate feedback from attendees in every aspect of debates that we can. And so Cliff, if you would go ahead and launch our first poll. Everybody, you will have, so panelists, you can't answer, but everybody else, you have 1 minute to fill out your votes. All right, 30 seconds, 40, I guess. All right, interesting. So this poll, as you can see, was to figure out what folks are most interested in hearing more about. And the winner was, should voting rules be set through a more nonpartisan process? Folks are also pretty interested in what kind of voting reform can we actually pass? And should voting security or voting access be our priority? So although I will say that several other things also got people are interested in a number of different things. So that is just information for you all for the rest of the evening as to what people are most interested in hearing about. And so with that, we will move on to our next speech in the affirmative. Representative Phillips, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking Braver Angels. I've been in Congress now for a little over 2 years, and this is the first debate I've had in 2 years in Congress. Thank all of you. So yeah, little hands. Sincerely, before I ran for Congress in 2018, I had taken totally for granted my own home state of Minnesota's very reasonably constructed congressional districts and remarkably secure and accessible elections. We have same-day voter registration, online voter registration, no ID requirement, and no excuse absentee voting. It's easy to vote in Minnesota. And I'd never stood in line for more than 10 minutes in my entire voting life since I was 18 years old. And I had no idea at all that fellow Americans in other parts of the country did not enjoy the same privileges and were subject to hurdles that effectively reduced their participation, particularly in minority communities throughout the country. And among my many inspirations to run was and continues to be an intense disgust with money in politics, what I call the influence of affluence. And that was before I had to switch from being a political donor to a shameless solicitor of resources. As a donor who was on every Democratic candidate's list and even some Republican candidates, I recognize that candidates do what fishermen do. They fish not just where the fish are, but where the biggest fish are, leaving most of the little fish totally ignored. And since we're on the subject of money in politics, the inside money game in Congress is even more disgusting, and we'll save that perhaps for a different day. But I believe that disenfranchisement and big money in politics is driving our political divisions and the anger in our country. And I decided to run on a platform very similar to HR 1. That meant no PAC money of any kind, no money from federal lobbyists, and no money from other members of Congress, which makes me the only one out of 535 members of Congress to commit to those principles. And lo and behold, I won my race, defeated one of the biggest PAC fundraisers in Congress at the time, and became the first Democrat to represent my district in 60 years. Now I've got 2 years under my belt, and I see my colleagues spending 10,000 hours per week, 10,000 hours per week collectively raising money instead of doing the work that they were sent to Washington to do. Not to mention the continued assaults on our democratic process by foreign actors and domestic state legislatures alike. HR 1, in my estimation, empowers voters, not politicians. It helps address all of the issues that are concerns of mine. It's not perfect by any stretch, but nor is it, as many in Washington would like you to believe, a partisan power grab of some kind or a federal takeover of our elections. In fact, the only place the proposals included in the bill do not have bipartisan support is, of course, in Washington, D.C. I think HR 1 would restore Americans' faith in government in two really important ways: reforming how we elect members of Congress and leveling the playing field for average voters who feel disenfranchised by big money in politics. Relative to how we elect members, the two most consequential provisions of HR 1 require independent redistricting commissions, which we've talked about, many support, in all 50 states, and removes roadblocks to states that wish to institute ranked choice voting, RCV, which, by the way, is already now being employed in 2 states at the federal level, both Maine and Alaska, not exactly liberal bastions, and was just used a couple weeks ago in the Virginia GOP gubernatorial primary. Redistricting commissions would ban gerrymandering, which of course is the process by which politicians effectively choose their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians. This would ensure more competitive districts, both legislative and congressional, and would elect more people with an incentive to engage in collaborative and respectful lawmaking rather than play to the extremes in their party's base. RCV is becoming my biggest policy priority because it rewards collaborative candidates by providing an incentive for candidates to build coalitions and earn the support of voters well beyond their active bases. And it rewards problem solvers over fire breathers. And please know, HR 1 does not impose ranked choice voting on any state. It just ensures that states have the technology necessary to administer it if they choose to proceed with it. Lastly, HR 1 restores Americans' faith in their government through its provisions addressing money in politics, which I despise. Like most Americans, including majorities of both Democrats and Republicans, as well as independents, I believe we should pass a constitutional amendment to undo the damage of Citizens United as soon as we possibly can. In the meantime, we can do a couple other things with HR 1. A, create a system of public financing of campaigns, just like Ronald Reagan used to win his elections, the presidential level back in the 1980s, that would empower low-dollar donors and diminish the influence of wealthy individuals and special interest groups. Also includes measures to counter the troubling rise in foreign-funded disinformation campaigns and requires transparency from domestic dark money groups as well. The provisions enjoy the support of, oh shoot, I've got so much more to say. I'm used to 5 minutes. Let me just say it's imperfect. I know that. I love this debate. I'm proud to have contributed to the bill as well. I'm honored to be with all of you. And I say it's time to make voting easier for more Americans. So let's pass HR 1. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Jazz hands for Representative Phillips. Very good. First, Mr. Beechen, go ahead. Ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, I'm going to ask a question against interest about one of the provisions of HR 1 I'm not really sure about because I want to hear the speaker's thought on them. So HR 1 has this matching donor provision where small donors get matched by federal funding to a certain degree, whereas large donors do not. I like this in theory. The problem is in practice, small donors tend to contribute, according to the political science research we have, pretty heavily to ideologically extreme candidates. So I'm worried that in primaries, where small donations matter a lot more than in general elections, you would end up getting a situation where people like Marjorie Taylor Greene end up getting a huge amount of money from the matching donor provisions, encouraging ideological extremism in both parties. So why do you think that this critique is off base?
What does he think? Yeah.
First, I don't think it's off base at all. Yeah, I don't think it's off base at all. I think it's a wonderful objection. In fact, small dollar donors have been empowered recently by technology, which is, I think, a great equalizer. But I will tell you something. What I like is, in this aspect, is that it's an incentive for candidates to make appeals to small dollar donors, to show up to small dollar donors, to not simply go to country clubs and boardrooms and raise from the big fish, if you will. And by the way, I should tell everybody, if I could wave my magic wand, we can overturn Citizens United and actually create an amendment to the Constitution to better govern our elections. I think we should cap contribution levels and cap spending levels. The best democracies in the world, in my estimations, are ones that limit how much money is spent so that we don't have a political industrial complex that benefits disproportionately vis-a-vis the voter.
All right, very good. So for our first attendee question, we're going to go with David Graham, who asks, how will voter IDs suppress legitimate voters from voting?
How will voter IDs suppress legitimate voters from voting?
Right, so I think what it's getting at is there are a number of provisions to suggestions to use voter ID laws. And if you're a legitimate voter, how does that result in voter suppression? I think is what we're getting at.
Well, let me take the converse, which is there are elderly people in retirement facilities, people who would love to vote who no longer have a driver's license. There are people who recently moved whose address may not match their photo ID. The use of a basic affidavit, which is, by the way, what this essentially would require as well, is to me a wonderful option. The fact of the matter is, if we made it easy in America and every state ensured that it was simple to get a voter ID, that there was a mobile van perhaps that would drive up to a retirement home or to communities in which people don't have transportation and could provide photo IDs, that might be a little bit different, but that is not the truth. It is such a fundamental right to vote in this country. It works beautifully in Minnesota. We don't have fraud and we don't require voter IDs. So that's my converse argument, is that it disenfranchises more. And it's kind of like the jury system in the United States. We'd rather let, we don't want to see even one guilty person go to the death chamber, for example, right? And I think the same thing should be for voters. We don't want to see one eligible American voter not be able to do so because of laws like this.
All right, very good. And we will do one more attendee question. And it is from Henry McHenry Jr. It's a great name. Is a deep structural issue for democratic government the funneling of all political contests through the two parties? What infrastructure besides parties is there for generating civic engagement and common ground among us? Is that working to enhance voter participation?
If anybody has read George Washington's farewell address, you will know that his gravest concerns are playing out right in front of us, political parties. I'm a Democrat, but I'm actually a Democrat who believes the nation would be well served by a competitive third party. And I think the political duopoly is a great challenge, a great problem, and frankly has as much to do with the disenfranchisement and anger of voters as anything else to which we are subject, plain and simple.
All right, interesting. Got jazz hands from both sides for that. With that, Representative Phillips is thanked. One more round of jazz hands for Representative Phillips. Yes. All right. So for the last speech in our first round this evening, and for a speech in the negative, we will go to Representative Ross. Go ahead and unmute. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, and Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity. Panelists, it's exciting. It's really quite refreshing to have this, especially under the auspices of the Braver Angels, and your mission has been tremendous, I think, in trying to bring together a country that is polarized as bad as it's ever been in my lifetime. I am a states' rights person. I always have been. I had the fortunate opportunity to serve in the Florida legislature in 2000 when we had the election debacle, and the political universe was centered in Tallahassee, Florida, where we grappled with how we were going to reconcile a terrible vote process that occurred that eventually was resolved by the United States Supreme Court. Under the Help America Voters Act, we then implemented, as was our prerogative and still is, a very secure, a very safe, a very accessible voting system. And 20 years later, we saw that Florida was a prime example of a good system, not only in the security and accessibility, but also in the ability to get the results in a timely fashion. You didn't hear about Florida being a contested state. It's interesting when I hear some of my participants talk about one-sidedness of the Republican Party. When I served in Congress, we had 237 members of the House, and only took 218 members to get a bill passed. But the Republicans couldn't come together for 218 votes on just about anything, let alone ordering lunch. So I think that regardless of public or the party structure, there are enough factions within each party that almost creates, a multi-party system. We had our Freedom Caucus, we had our Tuesday group, we had different factions that we have to deal with ourselves. But let me speak about H.R. 1. H.R. 1 is a true federal takeover of our election system. There is no question about that. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution specifically empowers the method and manner by which states will determine how they're going to elect their members of Congress and their electors to the Electoral College. We are creating a system under this particular law which would allow for something that has been highly controversial, and in my opinion would lead to a greater degree of fraud, and that's ballot harvesting. It's where groups, political parties, unions, corporations, PACs, whomever can keep knocking on a voter's door saying, have you turned in your ballot? Can I take it for you? In law, we have something called a chain of custody that determines that the evidence actually is what it is, and we can trace the chain of custody. With ballot harvesting, we're not going to know whether certain ballots were ever modified or even turned in. In fact, we had a case in North Carolina where a Republican candidate was accused of violating their law for ballot harvesting and was never seated to the United States Congress. One of the things that concerns me about this too is what we're talking about in funding campaigns. Some time ago, there was a fellow by the name of Lawton Childs, who was a United States Senator from Florida, and he limited his campaign to under $100 contribution and only from individuals. He still outraised everybody, but everybody who contributed had a family member, even the dog, contribute. What I'm saying is that if you're going to get small donors to be rewarded 6-to-1 by federal dollars into a campaign coffer, all you're going to do is create greater abuse, greater fraud, and you're not going to solve a problem. Look, if you think the federal government in a one-size-fits-all law is going to encourage people to come back to want to vote, I think you're misdirected. The sentiment of the American people is not that federal government is our savior. In fact, federal government truly is the problem, and to paraphrase Ronald Reagan. What we have to be able to do is to make sure that our states do what they have been empowered to do. Gerrymandering is against the law. In fact, we've seen that over and over again in rulings by the Supreme Court. We cannot discount the checks and balances in our system of justice that do allow for judicial review to make sure that these bad actors go away. Alabama versus the NAACP, or NAACP versus Alabama, 1958, it made sure that it protected the nonprofit contributors so that they didn't have to be disclosed because they were being harassed. This law would upend.
I have to ask you to wrap up.
I will stop right there and look forward to the questions.
All righty, wonderful. Jazz hands for Representative Ross. I may have to admit he's got the best accent thus far. Okay, so let's start with panelist questions, if there is one. Mr. Wanevu, was that a hand?
Yes, it was.
Great.
My question, Madam Chair, for the speaker is whether he believes there are any circumstances outside of combating gerrymandering where he believes it's legitimate for the federal government to intervene in the state elections process.
If I might, Madam Chair?
Please.
Yes, by all means. In fact, that's where I think we have voting rights acts. We have the federal government who has been, I think, through evolution of our judicial process, a great referee in making sure that voter suppression is continually on the decline. My concern about a panel is that, is it really independent? I mean, who picks them? Does the party in charge pick them? How do we go about making sure that they're going to be, totally independent? I will tell you, it is very disconcerting to me, especially I have seen, I was the victim of being gerrymandered out by my own party in the last election or the last cycle. And I couldn't participate because it's not my seat, it's the people's seat. But fortunately, the courts came in and corrected it. It happened again in North Carolina. It happens a lot. The one thing that I'm just impressing upon is that our system is far, far, far from perfect. But, and I want you to, I agree with you on this. I think this is where the federal government has played a significant role in refining to make sure that the state actors who are, again, empowered with the ability and authority to do elections, do it according to judicially appropriate, non-discriminatory, non-oppressive, and non-suppressive rules.
All right, excellent. So for our first attendee question, we're going to go to Christine Missick, who asks, doesn't limiting mail-in voting disproportionately affect the ability of workers with heavy schedules, like several jobs, high demand jobs, physicians, things like that? People with limited transportation, health problems, very rural locations, etc. Sorry. No, I'm done. Go ahead.
No, I apologize, Madam Chair. No, I'm not at all against mail-in voting. I think mail-in voting is very essential. I think it's absolutely appropriate. Universal mailing, where you get a ballot, whether you requested one or not, I have issues with. Voting is a right, in my opinion, and it is a right that you either exercise or you don't. If everybody exercised the right, we'd have 100% of those registered to vote voting, where we really have less than 50% now. I have no problem with mail-in voting. The thing that I have concern about is the sanctity and security of making sure that it is protected and it is the actual intent of the actual person who has that right to vote and who is exercising it by way of the mail-in process.
All right, and then we will take as a final question, a Florida specific question, which is from Lonnie Slonin. If you think that Florida's voting procedures are fair and effective, why do you not want all Americans to have this system? Why not use it as a model?
Couldn't agree more. Madam Chair, I could not agree more with the questioner. And I think that's exactly what each state ought to do, is use it as a model. I'm so glad to be part of this, just because having lived through it 20 years ago, and knowing that the states had every opportunity over the last 20 years to try to get it right. And it took this debacle, this election in 2020, to give rise and awareness to this. Look, we need serious voter reform. I agree with all the panelists who agree also that we need campaign finance reform. It is, as Representative Phillips pointed out, I spent a lot of time raising money that when I would rather have been doing other things, but it is a vice, I guess, of the process that we've got to address. But I do agree Florida has a good model. Other states should adopt it. Thank you.
All right. And with that, the Florida senator is thanked. Excuse me, Representative. Jazz hands for Representative Russ. All right. Yes. So we are now going to shift to the final debate section of the evening, which is response speeches. Each panelist will have 2 minutes to respond to what's been said. We will not take questions because this is intended to be sort of a lightning round where folks can speak to, having heard the whole debate and everyone's arguments, sort of give the last few things that they want to offer. Also, we'll go in reverse order, although we will stay with the affirmative negative structure. So, for a first response speech, I am looking at Congressman, Congressman Phillips. Go ahead and unmute. You have 2 minutes.
I'll take, this might be a first for everybody. I'll be a politician who takes less than the time allocated. How about that? I want to thank you. I want to focus on this evening and sharing some time with all of you. Wonderful questions, my fellow panelists of different perspectives. This is exactly what the country needs. And that's why I wanted to be here with all of you tonight. I learned from every one of you, your questions, our panelists' perspectives. And I think there's agreement that America is about innovation, it's about reformation, it's about being best in class as it relates to everything, economically, socially, and as it relates to, I should say, electorally. And that's what this is all about. I don't think we are doing it the best that we can. Certainly not the most effectively, safely, and in a manner that I think our founders would ultimately be proud of, which is to enhance voting in America. It's shamefully low. I think this will help. And I remind all, this is not a takeover of any state's elections. States will still conduct the elections with broad ranges available to them. But just like any federal law, it provides a benchmark, a standard that has to be met by all states, and therefore is something at least for consideration. I want to say one more quick thing. It probably isn't going anywhere right now, which is a shame. And it's primarily because we're not having debates just like this one in Congress. So if we can do that, we can identify the good, maybe make some compromises, and at least take some steps in the right direction to make security enhanced and most of all, restore faith in government. Thanks, everybody.
All right. With that, Dean Phillips' response speech is Dean Phillips is thanked. And you are right. That was less than 2 minutes. Very impressive. We will next go to Representative Ross.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and I'll be just as brief. Let's go back 1787, the summer. We're still there, man. We're having that same argument about how we're going to balance the rights of the people. We have the Federalists, we have the Anti-Federalists. What are we going to do? Madison knew that the only way he was going to get the Constitution that he wanted, that he presented, passed, is if he made a pledge to protect the interests of the Anti-Federalists, the states' rights people. That's where we got the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, I think, are so wonderful. They were advocated by the Anti-Federalists. They were supported by Madison as part of the compromise to get the Constitution passed. But the 10th Amendment is so important, where it reserves all of those rights not enumerated in the Constitution to the states. And I think that's what this debate's going to be about. It will continue. I hope that we make progress. I would hope that your generation, those of you that succeed me, will look at this as an ongoing obligation, and that no one party has a monopoly on good ideas. And best legislation is the bipartisan legislation that comes out of Congress. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this, and I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you.
All right. With that, Representative Ross is thanked. Excellent. Another politician under 2 minutes. Very impressive. So for our next response speech, we will go to Ms. Williams. You have 2 minutes.
Yes, I fight for justice for all. I love Democrats, Republicans, independents, non-voters, and others. In justice work, I do not get the luxury to discriminate against any one person. H.R. 1 is a direct result of not making a conscious effort to reauthorize the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 1965, or willingly protecting the voices of those who have been muted intentionally. It is our fight to fight, and if we are for each individual who lives here, we allow the people to be the voice of this country. We have to stop giving trade to those who can raise the most dollars and start giving affordability to those who listen to the most people. H.R. 1 was put in place because we failed to protect those who have been asking for centuries to have their voice heard. I appreciate your time tonight, and thank you for allowing me to be here.
All right, and thank you for being here, Ms. Williams. With that, Ms. Williams is thanked. And we will now move to Ms. Longwell. 2 minutes.
I'm going to start the thing I disagree, or I heard a couple times that I want to just push back on a little bit, which is the idea that there was something wrong with the 2020 election. Donald Trump's own head of cybersecurity said it was the most secure election in American history. We held a magnificent, amazing election amid a pandemic, an unprecedented turnout and interest. And we should actually be proud of that. Like, it is, what we did was actually terrific. They have been auditing the heck out of this election, recount after recount. And you know what? It turns out people really did a good job and it was done well. So don't let people tell you there was something wrong with this election. And don't let people tell you that there's not, at the bottom of these bills that are moving through the states, an attempt to both codify the lie that the election was fraudulent in some way, and to actually, in ways that are partisan, seek to restrict access to voting. That's happening. So if that really matters to you, if you really want to do something about that, stop focusing on HR 1, which is a thing that's not going to happen, and start putting your energy behind a clean voting bill that can tackle some of the serious problems in the system, and that could actually potentially garner bipartisan support, because otherwise it's just a bunch of people on a panel arguing with each other, and it's not something that can actually get done.
All right. With that, Ms. Longwell is thanked. Yes, more jazz hands, absolutely. We will now go to the response speech from Mr. Wannevu. 2 minutes.
Well, thanks again for inviting me to participate in this debate. I have too many points to sort of to get through them all in 2 minutes, but I will say, look, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. The Democratic Party is filled with very nice men like Congressman Phillips, who talk a lot about bipartisanship and need to bring the parties together to do something on voting rights and present it as an issue that everybody can unite around. I just do not have very much faith, as somebody who writes about politics every day, that a political party that would indulge the lie of the November 2020 election has as its near-term future support for a voting rights bill that would, in some states, probably be to their electoral disadvantage. It's as simple as that. I think it's important for people to understand that we're not here because there has been some crisis of voting fraud that was discovered a couple of years ago that Republicans are responding to. For one example, the Texas Attorney General's office reported, I think as of November's election, that between 2004 and November, they had prosecuted 150 cases of voter fraud out of 90 million ballots that had been cast in that time. We're not talking about voter ID and all these things because that there is some legitimate problem that is large enough to merit the disenfranchisement en masse of voters across Republican states. We're here because the Republican Party has perceived an electoral disadvantage that is the consequence of population growth, the radicalization of their party, and all of these things are things that they believe that they can respond to by restricting voting rights. So I agree with Congressman Ross. We are at a 1787 moment where we're going to be asked whether or not we believe in democracy and what our fundamental values are as a country. And unfortunately, I don't think that debate is going to be resolved by the passage of HR 1. I don't know that it has a very good chance of passage, but I do hope, again, as I said at the very beginning, that the conversation we're having now is going to prompt larger conversations about the structure of the American political system, what kind of country we believe this ought to be.
All right. And with that, Mr. Wannevu is thanked. Jazz hands, yes. And next, we will go to Ms. White. 2 minutes.
So one of the questions that everyone seemed to like when it was brought up was, what should be our priority, voting access or voting security? The answer is it's not an either or situation. We can have both. The problem is that this conversation is often so polarized, which is why I really appreciate a debate like this. Any attempt to restrict or any attempt to restrict voting access or promote it is seen by the other side as just an exacerbated attempt to limit the rights of one party or the other. It's just not the case. And I think that Georgia is actually a great example of this. Obviously, Georgia passed a pretty controversial bill pretty recently that was pretty lambasted. And once you actually read the text of the bill, there's not that much that's that controversial about it. Actually, Georgia codified an automatic registration process. It also offers 16 days of early voting, which is more than what Stacey Abrams was pushing for, which was 15 days. And Georgia voters can request absentee ballots without explanation, which Democratic voters in, for example, the state of Delaware can't do. So, it's hard for me to hear the arguments of, well, voting rights are being so restricted, especially in the case of Georgia, when actually these states are doing a lot to make exceptions for pandemic style voting, which is mail-in voting, absentee voting, and they're understanding that that is going to be the system moving forward, like it or not. And so if we're rewriting the law to accommodate those voters, but we're also making sure that our elections are as secure as they possibly can be, we're going to have a pretty good system. And I think that that's the way that a lot of other states should move in as well. And And hopefully, you know, we can come to some sort of bipartisan agreement and we can overlook the insane allegations by Donald Trump that Dominion's machines are being hacked by Venezuelans, and, you know, also the really over the top accusations that Georgia is trying to disenfranchise all voters, which is just not true. And we can come to some sort of agreement that there are sensible voting reforms that everyone should be able to get behind, that are possible, you know, if you put forth the right bill.
All right, very good. With that, Ms. White is thanked. Jazz hands for Kaylee McGee White. Yes, very good. And for our second to last speech, we'll go to Mr. Beechen. 2 minutes.
I'd like to address 3 different points that have been brought up briefly, as quickly as I can. The first is a question of the legitimate interest states have in safeguarding against fraud. They've done that already. There is virtually no fraud in the American voter system, and there hasn't been for a very long time. One study found that voter fraud was less common than getting struck by lightning. It is not a real concern. There is no compelling interest that states have in passing new laws to try to prevent it. The second point is this notion of a federal takeover. I find it very strange. Preventing states from doing things and requiring certain infrastructural improvements is not the same thing as entirely taking over administration of elections. To use an analogy, setting federal highway safety standards is not the same thing as getting rid of local traffic cops and replacing them with the FBI. Setting up these new laws does not cause the federal government to administer elections at the local level. It merely creates standards that states have to abide so they don't engage in anti-democratic practices. And that brings us to the last point, which is the Georgia law that I'm glad Ms. White just brought up. There are a lot of different things in the Georgia law. I have read it, and there's quite a bit that's controversial in it. One of the most notable provisions, which was not mentioned, is one that allows for a takeover of local election administration and board functions by the state legislature. Right? It can just appoint partisans to run these things if it wants to, if it deems, based on complaints that it can solicit, that the process was somehow fraudulent. What this amounts to is Georgia's Republican-controlled legislature giving itself the ability and the will, as it's demonstrated in places like Fulton County, to override the will of Democratic-related voters. H.R. 1 actually doesn't have a good remedy for this, which brings me to the sort of fourth and broader point, is right now, I'm a little bit despondent because I take Sarah's point very clearly that Joe Manchin isn't in favor of H.R. 1, or at least is sort of on the fence right now. But Joe Manchin doesn't want to blow up the filibuster for anything. And so I'm concerned right now that what's going to happen is the Democrats will do nothing on the most important issue facing them right now. And in 2024, we will have a crisis of democracy of truly unprecedented proportions, even with 2020 just in the rearview mirror.
All right. And with that, Mr. Beechen is thanked. And for our final speech of the night, Mr. Engel, 2 minutes, take us home.
I will. You know, when I started this debate, I said I would vote against H.R. 1. And I've kind of changed that a bit based on this debate and some of the things that I've heard and learned by some of the speakers. And there are some things that are worth, supporting. But I'm not sure the Democrats want my support or would consider, amendments that I might offer. When I made my initial remarks, I said this is a Washington, D.C. bill, and that's true, but it is also a Democratic Party bill. And just as Republicans get criticized in Georgia for being partisan, well, the same criticisms, I think, are equally valid here, that the Democrats are using the laws or want to use the laws in a partisan way. So when one party comes to me and says they're just trying to strengthen democracy, I get a little skeptical. So at bottom, this bill is about power and who's going to have the power, on the federal versus state or the Republican versus Democrat. I don't think either party has a moral high ground when it comes to election administration questions, because it all is about ensuring that they can remain in the majority. Thank you.
All right. With that, Mr. Engel is thanked.
Thanks.
I'd like to ask for one more round of jazz hands for our fabulous panelists this evening and for everybody who helped make this happen. So we're now going to do just a little bit of reflection. We have one or two more things. I promise I'll get you out of here in time for bed on the East Coast and dinner on the West Coast. So we're just going to take a couple minutes, and attendees, I invite you to participate in this to reflect on two questions. One is, what did you learn this evening? And the other is, what did you enjoy? And so attendees, you can put your answers in the chat, which we have opened up once again for this purpose. And panelists, some of you spoke to this already, but if there's anything additional you'd like to add, or anything that you want to say about what you learned tonight or what you enjoyed, go ahead and just raise your hand. We'll go around. I'm actually going to start, not because I need to give you thinking time, although maybe it'll help you, but because I was so impressed, particularly in our response, in the round of response speeches. I feel like there was a lot that came out that was good and that was nuanced and complex. And this debate, excuse me, more than many I've seen, y'all did a really good job of listening to each other and saying, well, yeah, that's right, but this I don't agree with, and that's right, but this I don't agree with. And so, yeah, I was quite impressed. I really enjoyed that. That's the thing I really love when that happens successfully. Other thoughts? Silas.
Well, I learned that there was actually more room for common ground than I ever would have expected. There was obviously provisions that were not common ground, but I was surprised to hear some that were. It's not something I thought would come out of a debate on such a potentially partisan topic. And then the thing that I enjoyed was, I enjoyed the response speeches, which I felt were very responsive and really did further the conversation. So I really appreciated the clear mental attentiveness of all the panelists to listen to each other throughout the evening and then reflect that in their response speeches.
Absolutely. Also, panelists, I don't know if you're keeping an eye on the chat, but wonderful things are coming in just about complexity, breadth, depth, respectful nature of the discussion, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, other panelists, raise your hand if you want to say something about what you learned tonight or what you enjoyed.
Well, I'm just going to reiterate one more time, if I might, Madam Chair.
Sure, go for it. And then Sheba, you next.
Yeah, to all of you, panelists and participants, we're modeling exactly what could become a really important and maybe even equally, if not more effective, tool to repair the country than any bill that could ever be passed. And that's what I learned, is the joy of thoughtful, respectful debate, disagreeing without being disagreeable. All of you share that ethos, and I'm grateful. And tonight has made me hopeful. And I want to just thank all of you for that before signing off. So Godspeed, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Representative Phillips. Absolutely. Hopeful. I share that. Sheba, go ahead.
I learned that I do not know how to raise my hands when there's a live transcript, but I appreciate everybody bringing the different perspectives. I think we may all be a little purple. I saw that in the chat. And we want the best for the people who live in this country. I think that we all have gotten to a point where we know that the power needs to be shifted to the people. You know, this bill may not be perfect. I don't know one that is, but I do appreciate everyone's perspective and bringing to the forefront in a constructive manner how we can make this country better. So I appreciate you all.
All right, we appreciate you. Very good. Sarah.
You know, just listening to the thoughtful conversation, it does strike me, a couple things struck me. One, the last exchange between Kaylee and Zach, who I'm using as my polls to orient myself between. I mean, part of what Zach said, where there's not a lot of voter fraud, is absolutely true. But what Kaylee said is also true, that the pandemic has changed the way we're voting probably forever. There are a lot of states where we already voted a lot by absentee and by mail, but like that's going to become much more the norm. People are like, we did this, we like it, which probably is going to force us to think a little bit differently about how we make sure that there is security around that. And like, those are good conversations to have. And I think that rather than, I think it was Osita made this point or asked me this question. It's a good one, is like, there's this sense of like, well, Republicans won't do anything. And I understand that sentiment, but I do think, look, you hear the Republicans on this panel saying, well, I believe in voting. I believe in access. Make them prove it, right? So go to them and say, all right, here's some things that improve access. You going to come with me on it? And I think until you've done that, though, you shouldn't write them off until you've done that. It's just a thought.
Interesting. All right. Kaylee.
Oh, I enjoyed someone's comment in the comment section where they were saying, why can't Republicans and Democrats who are in Congress have the same kind of conversation? And honestly, I think that if they would, HR 1 wouldn't have been introduced in the first place. And I think that's a huge part of the problem, is that both parties are, like I was saying earlier, this conversation is so polarized where both parties blame each other for the election system as is, and both are completely unwilling to reform it in a way that might achieve bipartisan support. And so my hope is obviously that, if voters like us continue to have conversation like this and push our elected leaders to also have conversations like this, maybe we actually will have a good shot at changing the system in a way that will really benefit everyone involved.
Wonderful. Yeah. There were several comments that I've seen go by that are like, yeah, Congress, like, can you do this? Can we do this? Because like, boy, it would be better. Thank you, Kaylee. We'll take one or two more panelist comments if you have them. And Cliff, if you would queue up, get ready to give our final poll of the night, that would be great. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and move to that. Oh, Osita, sorry, go ahead.
I enjoyed the discussion for many of the reasons that people have said. If I could leave with one thought, it would just be that, I think it's true that Americans do want to see something happen on voting rights. And the fact that something is not happening, and the fact that Congress is not able to get this done, is an indication of the point that I began my speaking tonight with. We need a more responsive political system from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I have been really surprised by the common ground that has shown up here tonight. And yeah, this is just great from several angles. Cliff, if you would go ahead and launch our second poll, I want to keep my promise to get folks out of here in time. All right, you have 1 minute, everybody. All right. Ten seconds left. Give you a little extra time because there we go. Okay, great. All right, so yeah, looks like folks really liked this debate. So what did you like about the debate? The top ranking answer was respect shown to others, but folks also are saying they have a much deeper understanding of the issues. They really felt like the truthfulness and honesty of the opinions shared was really high. Let's see, over half the folks say that what they heard tonight either somewhat or strongly affects how they think about this issue. And ooh, that's a good number. So my favorite question on this is always, how has your thinking about the other side changed during the debate? Usually we get 80 or 85%. This one is 94% for I'm more able to see how the other side thinks. So well done, everybody. Jazz hands. I think this was really good in that way. A couple final just housekeeping notes. We have an evaluation form that we'd like you all to fill out. There will be a link in the chat very shortly. And if you liked tonight's debate, sign up for the next one. The next one is on the role of violence in the political process, and it's on June 17th, a Thursday. That one will be a national community debate, which means that anyone who comes is invited to give a speech. So that link is also going into the chat box. And finally, Randy, if you would share with us why anyone who isn't already should consider becoming part of the Braver Angels family, that would be great.
Thanks so much, April. So, this is the second Coliseum debate in a row that we've had. We've talked about election security and access issues. And, we know it's not just a contentious topic, but it's also a really important one that we really need to be having, among all of us. As one of the speakers mentioned, we can have security and access at the same time, but we can only really have those things if we're willing to talk to one another and to kind of calibrate how we get there together. And it's not just among our representatives that we need to have this conversation, it's us that needs to have it. So, we can really get the more responsive system that we're looking for. There's so many topics that are just as hard as this, but just as important. And, I've seen a lot of people who are afraid of talking about the really important topics because, one of the things that they're afraid of is the risk to their relationships, how they'll feel about the people that are so close to them are going to react and what they'll think of those folks. And I think these conversations are still so important. So we need to have a way to have them. And I think that Braver Angels just offers so many great ways to have those conversations. These debates, through our workshops, even like guided one-to-one conversations, which I and a lot of other members have experienced directly. It's fantastic. So I definitely encourage those of you who are not yet members to join us. Come to more events like these national ones, but also I would encourage you to join a local alliance. I mean, it's one of the most effective ways to make an impact. If you feel like you're a little bit powerless at this point, join a local alliance and you can actually have an effect on your local politics. And not only that, but the relationships that you make are incredible. So I'm a California state coordinator, and the three sets of co-chairs of our alliances in Southern California all have said that when they don't understand an issue from the other side's perspective, they go to their respective co-chair and they ask them about it. And they do that all the time. And it has given them such a better understanding of what's going on in the minds of those who disagree with them. So, the whole process may not change your beliefs, but it'll make you a much more effective, advocate of your own beliefs and help you really understand what people on the other side are thinking about in these really important issues. So thanks so much for joining us. And I really hope to see all of you at our future events. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Randy. And I actually would just like everybody to now give a round of jazz hands to Randy and Silas and Leslie and Cliff and all the folks who worked so hard to make this happen. Dell and David Amaya, a lot of folks behind the scenes worked real hard, and you can show your faces on the screen now if you want to. But thank you. We have a fantastic volunteer team, by the way. So if you are not already involved with us, join us. I swear that we're the most fun part of Braver Angels. And, after listening to Randy, I expect everyone to join anyway. So come join us, volunteer, help these conversations continue. And we're going to end with a song. But the last thing I'll say before we go is I want to pick up on something Representative Phillips said, which is hope. I think that if there's, that's the reason I joined Braver Angels a long time ago. And it's one of the most important dividends I still get from being part of this. So thank you, everybody who's here tonight, on panel and off, for helping to restore my hope in my country. All right, Randy, let's hear that song.
It's not black, it's not white, it's not wrong, it's not right, it's not red, it's not blue, it's just me and you. It's not rich, it's not poor, somewhere in the middle is the open door. If our points of view don't quite see eye to eye, well, that's all the more reason why we need a United States of humanity. We need it, the United States of humanity, the sum of every part. We need a United States of humanity. revolution of the heart. We're living in a great divide. This fear of each other is our suicide. I believe love's gonna keep us alive, but only if we decide. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolutions in a revolution of the heart. It's not just the conversation, it's the listening. It takes every voice feeling heard to let freedom ring. We can solve our future, heal our history, sting, step toward our common ground, spread our better age of wings. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolution is a revolution of the heart. Oh,
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a beautiful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.